Joining us in the broadcast this minute, and former Chief Economic Advisor to the Government of India and former Executive Director, IMF, joining us from New Delhi. Thanks very much, Arvind, for speaking with us. Of course, I have to begin by asking you what your key takeaways from the budget have been.
So, there are two parts to the budget. The part A, which talks about overall policy, whether it's in terms of macroeconomics, industry, social sectors, etc. And by and large, in fact, overall, I am very happy with the approach adopted and also the specific measures taken in that part of the speech. We can discuss the details subsequently. But the part B is very mixed. The part which I'm not very happy about is kind of the slightly old approach to taxation, where the marginal tax have been raised. And the reason is because this has been happening for the last 3 or 4 years. But offsetting that, of course, is a serious effort to make tax payment, ease of tax payment, as they call it, as it's rightly called, easier. Earlier there used to be criticism of tax terrorism, but I think serious efforts have been made to make it easier to pay taxes, and the role of technology, digitization, etc. has been very important actually in every area of government functioning here. Now, just very briefly to come back to the part A, in your review just now you mentioned many of them, and I would like to mention only one or two things. For example, I was one of those who was against going off the FRBM glide path of fiscal deficit by giving what is called a stimulus to the economy. I do not agree with that approach, and I'm happy that approach has not been adopted, and there's an effort at least to stick with the fiscal deficit targets. Secondly, everybody, including myself, had talked about the financial problems and said that this is a threat to the recovery of the growth rate and sustaining growth. So there seems to have been clear effort to look at regulatory systems, to look at financial market reforms, and even to make certain provisions, the minimum necessary in terms of bonds or other budgetary allocations. So that is one example. The second one, again, you already talked about this whole continuing liberalization of FII, FDI, PFI, but there's one very innovative scheme which hasn't been noted as far as I've seen by anybody, is this thing about attracting a high-tech industry which is essentially monopolistic in nature because it has high economies of scale. So it's been announced that there would be incentives given, but there'll be some kind of an auction procedure to select the company. I think that's an excellent idea, because whenever you have a monopoly operator, there is always this suspicion in public mind in democratic countries that you have kind of selected somebody on the basis of underhand things. So I found that quite innovative, that some kind of an auction procedure. Of course, the exact procedure and method of doing it will have to be defined, but I thought that's a very good idea. And so along with the liberalization in the GIFT, the financial center, etc. So, and the third one, the selective reform. Usually they are not wholesale reforms in any budget, but the two key ones which caught my attention is that finally this simplification of the labor code, which into 4 out of 16, 17, I don't know how many there are, has been reiterated and hopefully will get done. We've been waiting for it for a couple of years. And the second one was the Model Rent Control Act, which again people have not noticed, but because I have been talking about the problems with the Rent Control Act for 20-30 years, it's very encouraging to see that somebody has realized that you won't have rental housing in this country. I mean, this is a point I'm sorry to say from myself, but I've said this like 30 years ago. So I'm encouraged by that. So that is the third aspect. And the fourth one, again, you have pointed out the effort to link higher education and high skills with the demands of the economy. So these are kind of the 4 points I would point out with respect to the correct approach to encouraging business, to encouraging growth, etc. And very briefly, on the second part of Part A, where it's more to do with social sectors, etc., again, I think there has been restraint. Of course, certain schemes had been announced in the interim budget, which came 2-3 months ago before the election. But it's good that they haven't announced a whole host of additional schemes. On the other hand, they've also said they would review some of the things which have not worked and maybe try to reform them. For example, the electricity scheme, the Uday, which has not really fulfilled its purpose, and also made additional allocations to some of the others.
Right. Arvind Virmani, before we let you go, do you think that the aspect of job creation and the expectations that have been riding high on this budget, of course it was a follow-up to the interim budget, but do you think that the aspect of job creation has been addressed adequately?
I think what it is the approach which was outlined in the economic survey. Again, people have not caught the connection between the economic survey. I think there's much more connection than is usual because they laid the groundwork. What they were saying is that things are integrated and they are not going to look in silos, that there's a job problem or there's an export problem or there is a manufacturing problem. They would look at it in an integrated way. So I think the budget certainly doesn't complete that process, but what I do like about it is that approach is a correct one. By giving just SOPs for employment in X or Y, you never permanently solve that problem. So to some extent I agree that perhaps not enough has been done, but there is the labor law reform, there is this approach, there is something on tourism, etc. So the attempt is to have inclusive growth overall, which will also create jobs, create employment, etc. The startup part, which has been emphasized, is very important. The economic survey showed how it is the new companies, and as they grow, you have to protect and encourage to grow, not protect the old MSMEs which have been there for 20 years, 30 years without growing. So the change in approach is very good. And I really don't expect, given my knowledge of earlier budget, that everything will be sorted out in one budget.
All right, that's of course a good point to end that discussion on and follow up that aspect with our studio guest. Thanks very much for the moment, Arvind Virmani, for those perspectives. Now, Ashok Jha and Jayant Krishna are right here with me. Also joining us in just a short bit will be Andrew Whitehead. Coming to you first, Ashok Jha, the ideas that have been talked about in terms of, for example, the electric vehicles, the artificial intelligence, these are huge aspects that the government has been focusing on. Would you say that this is a forward-looking budget when it comes to the 5 trillion economy aim that it has already set? Would you also say that this was not a populist budget to the way that it was deemed to be?
See, there wasn't very much scope for the finance minister to basically, talk about a populist budget, because there's not too much money available to the finance minister at the moment, since after the interim budget, all the populist measures had been announced at that point in time. Right. And if you look at the expenditure statement, there is very little scope for the minister to increase expenditure unless the revenues are augmented. And there is very little scope for augmenting revenues without raising taxes to an appreciable degree, which has not been done. So therefore, the scope for populism this time around didn't arise. Plus, the fact is that elections are already over. So therefore, why go in for a populist budget now?
Jayant Krishna, would you agree there, and also the big ideas that we have been talking about, your key takeaways on those aspects?
I think there are some very tangible ideas in the budget when it comes to our movement transition from a $2.5 to a $3 trillion economy to a $5 trillion economy. I would reckon the big ideas are, one is that in the space sector, now since in satellites and things like that, India has made huge advent. So to commercialize that, they're setting up a corporation. I think that's a big idea. This National Research Foundation that they're talking about, as a country, we spend very little on R&D. So I think that's a big idea to take it forward, where funds, innovation fund from ministries will come in a common pool and then the disbursements will happen. I think that's very good. Also, the Swachh Bharat mission has come so far, but I think it's very good strategically to combine it with the solid waste management aspect of it also. Because if you look at the entire value chain of rural sanitation and hygiene, I think the two go hand in hand. So I think that's a big idea where the next set of quantum leap would happen. Also, I think on the electric mobility, electric vehicles, I think a lot of impetus have been given to the manufacturers as well as to the consumers, because their loan that they take for those vehicles, about 1.5 lakh would come back to them through income tax benefits and so on and so forth. I think those are because the pollution is a big concern in our country, and there is a limit to which these fuels will be available. So I think that's one big idea. And also, I think the labor laws which have been liberalized, if you look at large, it's a stumbling block. Any overseas investor, when it looks at a complex web of 44 federal labor laws and a whole lot of plethora of labor laws at the state level, they get confused. Look at the Industrial Disputes Act itself. You can't almost close down a unit and sack the labor at all, even if your business model has failed and you want to exit. So I think, once you codify those 44 laws of Government of India into 4 categories and make it simpler and more rational to understand, and what the budget has not done is, perhaps at the state level, Centre could have presented a model act replacing all the acts and have a phased-wise, a time-bound implementation plan for that. Okay. I think that would have really gone big time. And on the energy sector, this national grid that they're talking about, I think at least somebody is ideating it to take it forward. I think these, to my mind, are some of the big ideas in the budget.
To what extent is this budget, to both of you, a boost to startups? Because the angel tax, do you think that is, in the short term and the long term, going to be a huge a boost for those eyeing startups? I think,
even in the economic survey, if you look at yesterday, it talks about, how to nurse the dwarfs to become giants. What they essentially meant that, how SME units are, the entire ecosystem becomes more conducive for them to be propelled into big league kind of a thing. So I think this angel tax benefit that no great scrutiny will happen if you have filed your returns properly, that's a big step. Yeah. And the payment platform that they're talking about, in the SME sector, payment delays are inordinate. Yeah. So once this digital platform comes up, for buyers and sellers and things like that and vendors, I think that will be a big boost to my mind. And also, what I heard the finance minister say, she meant, of course, we'll look at the details in print, but she said that there'll be an online platform where loans up to 1 crore rupees would get a sanction in time-bound manner, if other things are in place and things like that. So I think, and overall banking reforms, of course, some banking reforms have been announced, but not as many as one expected. But whatever reforms will happen, eventually it will also ease out the availability of credit to SME sector. I think these are some ideas for SME sector in the budget.
Ashok Shah?
Yeah, actually, see, I think that this budget has 3-4 very positive features. The first thing, of course, is the focus on housing, affordable housing, because that is something that is going to generate even employment. Apart from the fact that it's a good infrastructure activity. The second is the focus that has been put even on agriculture, especially, related occupations in agriculture like dairying, because agriculture is clearly in distress at the moment. And so any focus on agriculture was most welcome. The third area is the infrastructure, in terms of the recapitalization of banks. Hopefully, will get a little bit boost to the infrastructure sector, although bank capital will not really go in so much for long-term lending. It goes in for shorter or medium-term lending. So, and the fourth is the FDI. They have planned to increase the FDI in media, for instance, in aviation, These will obviously increase the investment into the country.
Yes.
But there are 2-3 issues which I thought was not negative, but definitely not very positive. One, of course, was the fact that they've raised customs duties.
Yes.
On a few odd, items. Over the last few years, the effort has been to reduce customs duties so that, we become part of the...
Does that come as a complete surprise, though? Let me also get Andrew Whitehead on that aspect. If you would like to weigh in on the point that Ashok Jha was just making there, Mr. Whitehead, and also if you had to describe to our viewers what the key takeaways from the budget have been in a single sentence, what would that be?
I think it was a very cautious budget. I think it was rather politically flat. There was a lot of detail, a lot of minor moves, a lot of tidying up. But there was no commanding top line. So I think journalists have got a real problem working out what was the key aspect of this budget. I think it's fair to say that the Narendra Modi government won re-election in spite of, rather than because of, its record in job creation. So there was a lot of talk ahead of the budget about whether there'd be an eye-catching move to stimulate the economy and make a statement about creating lots of jobs. And with the possible exception of the refinancing of public sector banks, I didn't see that. On the other hand, of course, Nirmala Sitharaman's only been in the job for a few weeks. This is her maiden budget. And to use a cricketing analogy, she perhaps thought she needed to play herself in, gain authority in the job, win the confidence of the markets. And I think she's made a fairly good start in those terms.
And would you say that the aspects that have been given a lot of importance in terms of electric vehicles, artificial intelligence, all of these do not come as a complete surprise, given the weightage that the government has been giving to those aspects in the previous term as well?
Well, that's right. I mean, Narendra Modi has always had a huge emphasis on technology and technology-driven economic growth. I think it's very interesting that she made so much emphasis on electric vehicles and on making more commercial capital out of the space industry. And I think that's a sign of a go-ahead outlook. But to be honest, most of this was just words, and it's deeds that's really going to matter.
All right. We're completely out of time in this edition. I'm going to have to thank you at that point, Andrew Whitehead. I appreciate very much for joining us with those perspectives. We'll, of course, continue to delve deeper into all of those aspects. We're taking a very short break at this point. Much more coming up on the other side. Stay with us.